Javert off the track. Javert made his way with slow steps from the Rue de l'Homme Armé. He walked with his head down, for the first time in his life, and for the first time in his life as well, with his hands behind his back. He plunged into the silent streets. Still, he followed one direction. He took the shortest route towards the Seine, reached the Quai des Ormes, went along the quay, passed the Grève, and stopped at a little distance from the post of the Place du Châtelet, near the corner of the Pont Notre-Dame. The Seine there forms between the Pont Notre-Dame and the Pont au Change in one direction, and in the other, between the Quai de la Mégisserie and the Quai aux Fleurs, a sort of square lake crossed by a rapid. Javert leaned both elbows on the parapet, with his chin in his hands, and while his fingers were clenched mechanically in the thickest of his whiskers, he reflected. There had been a new thing, a revolution, a catastrophe in the depths of his being, and there was matter for self-examination. Javert was suffering frightfully. For some hours, Javert had ceased to be natural. He was troubled. This brain, so limpid in its blindness, had lost its transparency. There was a cloud in this crystal. Javert felt that duty was growing weaker in his conscience, and that he could not hide it from himself. When he had so unexpectedly met Jean Valjean upon the beach of the Seine, there had been in him something of the wolf which seizes his prey again, and of the dog which again finds its master. He saw before him two roads, both equally straight, but he saw two, and that terrified him. Him, who had never in his life known but one straight line. In bitter anguish, these two roads were contradictory. One of these two straight lines excluded the other. Which of the two was the true one? His condition was inexpressible. One thing had astonished him, that Jean Valjean had spared him, and one thing had petrified him, that he, Javert, had spared Jean Valjean. Where was he? He sought himself and found himself no longer. What should he do now? Give up Jean Valjean? That was wrong. Leave Jean Valjean free? That was wrong. In the first case, the man of authority would fall lower than the man of the galley. In the second, a convict rose higher than the law and set his foot upon it. In both cases, dishonor to him, Javert. In every course which was open to him, there was a fall. Destiny has certain extremities, precipitous upon the impossible, and beyond which life is no more than an abyss. Javert was at one of these extremities. One of his causes of anxiety was that he was compelled to think. The very violence of all these contradictory emotions forced him to it. Thought was an unaccustomed thing to him, and singularly painful. There is always a certain amount of internal rebellion in thought, and he was irritated at having it within him. Upon what should he resolve? A single resource remained, to return immediately to the Rue de l'Homme Armé, and have Jean Valjean arrested. It was clear that was what he must do. He could not. Something barred the way to him on that side. Something? What? Is there anything else in the world besides tribunals, sentences, police, and authority? Javert's ideas were overturned. Javert felt that something horrible was penetrating his soul. Admiration for a convict. Respect for a galley slave. Can that be possible? He shuddered at it, yet could not shake it off. It was useless to struggle. He was reduced to confess before his own inner tribunal the sublimity of this wretch. That was hateful. His supreme anguish was the loss of all certainty. He felt that he was uprooted. The code was now but a stump in his hand. He had to do with scruples of an unknown species. There was in him a revelation of feeling, entirely distinct from the declarations of the law, his only standard hitherto. To retain his old virtue, that no longer sufficed. An entire order of unexpected facts arose and subjugated him. An entire new world appeared to his soul. Favor accepted and returned. Devotion, compassion, indulgence, acts of violence committed by pity upon austerity, respect of persons, no more final condemnation, no more damnation, the possibility of a tear in the eye of the law, a mysterious justice according to God going counter to justice according to men. He perceived in the darkness the fearful rising of an unknown moral sun. He was horrified and blinded by it. An owl compelled to an eagle's gaze. He asked himself, this convict, this desperate man, whom I have pursued even to persecution, and who has had me beneath his feet, and could have avenged himself, and who ought to have done so, as well as for his revenge as for his security. In granting me life and sparing me, what has he done? His duty? No, something more. And I, in sparing him in my turn, what have I done? My duty? No, something more. There is then something more than duty. Here he was startled. Since he had been of the age of a man, and an official, he had put almost all his religion into the police, being, and we employ these words here, without the slightest irony, and in the most serious acceptation, being, as we have said, a spy as men are priests. He had a superior, Monsieur Gisquet. He had scarcely thought until today of that other superior, God. This new chief, God, he felt unawares, and was perplexed thereat. God, always interior to man, and unyielding, he the true conscience, to the false a prohibition to the spark and to extinguish itself, an order to the ray to remember the sun, an injunction to the soul to recognize the real absolute when it is confronted with the fictitious absolute. Humanity imperishable, the human heart inadmissible. That splendid phenomenon, the most beautiful perhaps of our interior wonders. Did Javert comprehend it? Did Javert penetrate it? Did Javert form any idea of it? Evidently not. But under the pressure of this incontestable incomprehensible, he felt that his head was bursting. He was the less transfigured than the victim of this miracle. He bore it exasperated. He saw in it only an immense difficulty of existence. It seemed to him that henceforth his breathing would be oppressed forever. Could that be endurable? No. Unnatural state, if ever there was one. There were only two ways to get out of it. One, to go resolutely to Jean Valjean and return the man of the galleys to the dungeon. The other? Javert left the parapet, and his head erect this time, made his way with a firm step toward the post indicated by a lamp at one of the corners of the Place du Châtelet. On reaching it, he saw a sergeant de ville through the window, and he entered. Javert gave his name, showed his card to the sergeant, and sat down at the table of the post, on which the candle was burning. There was a pen on the table, a leaden inkstand, and some paper in readiness for chance reports and the orders of the night patrol. Javert took the pen and a sheet of paper and began to write. This is what he wrote. Some observations for the benefit of the service. First, I beg Monsieur the Prefect to glance at this. Secondly, the prisoners, on their return from examination, take off their shoes and remain barefooted upon the pavement while they are searched. Many cough on returning to the prison. This involves hospital expenses. Thirdly, spinning is good, with relays of officers at intervals, but there should be, on important occasions, 2 officers at least who do not lose sight of each other, so that if, for any cause whatever, one officer becomes weak in the service, the other is watching him and supplies his place. Fourthly, it is difficult to explain why the special regulation of the prison of the Madeleine forbids a prisoner having a chair, even on paying for it. Fifthly, at the Madeleine there are only 2 bars to the sutler's window, which enables the sutler to let the prisoners touch her hand. Sixthly, the prisoners, called barkers, who call the other prisoners to the parlour, make the prisoner pay them 2 sous for calling his name distinctly. This is a theft. Seventhly, for a dropped thread they retain 10 sous from the prisoner in the weaving shop. This is an abuse on the part of the contractor, since the cloth is just as good. Javert wrote these lines in his calmest and most correct handwriting, not omitting a dot, and making the paper squeak resolutely under his pen. Beneath the last line he signed, Javert, Inspector of the First Class, at the poste of the Place du Châtelet, June 7th, 1832, about 1 o'clock in the morning. Javert dried the fresh ink of paper, folded it like a letter, sealed it, wrote on the back, Note for the Administration, left it on the table, and went out of the poste. The glazed and grated door closed behind him. He again crossed the Place du Châtelet diagonally, regained the key, and returned with automatic precision to the very point at which he had left a quarter of an hour before. He leaned over there and found himself again in the same attitude, on the same stone of the parapet. It seemed as if he had not stirred. The darkness was complete. It was the sepulchral moment which follows midnight. A ceiling of clouds concealed the stars. The sky was only an ominous depth. The houses in the city no longer showed a single light. Nobody was passing. All he could see of the streets and the quays was deserted. Notre Dame and the towers of the Palais de Justice seemed like features of the night. A lamp reddened the curb of the quay. The silhouettes of the bridges were distorted in the mist, one behind the other, The rains had swelled the river. The place where Javert was leaning was, it will be remembered, situated exactly over the rapids of the Seine, perpendicularly over that formidable whirlpool which knots and unknots itself like an endless screw. Javert bent his head and looked. All was black. He could distinguish nothing. A fierce breath rose from that abyss. The swollen river guessed at rather than perceived the tragical whispering of the flood, the dismal vastness of the arches of the bridge, the imaginable fall into that gloomy void. All that shadow was full of horror. Javert remained for some minutes motionless, gazing into that opening of darkness. He contemplated the invisible with a fixedness which resembled attention. The water gurgled. Suddenly, he took off his hat and laid it on the edge of the quay. A moment afterward, a tall and black form, which, from the distance, some belated passer might have taken for a phantom, appeared standing on the parapet, bent towards the Seine, then sprang up, and fell straight into the darkness. There was a dull splash, and the shadow alone was in the secret of the convulsions of that obscure form which had disappeared under the water.